Hi, I'm Joyce Harper, Professor of Reproductive Science at the Institute for Women's Health at University College London. Welcome to Season 3 of my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? This season, we'll be diving into topics that explore how to achieve good health and happiness. I'll be speaking with leading experts who will provide evidence-based advice and debunk some of the many myths around our health. Additionally, I'll be having conversations with individuals who bring unique perspectives through their lived experiences. In Season 3, we'll cover a diverse range of topics, including reproductive anatomy, inspiring female icons, chronic health conditions, factors that influence our well-being, and global women's health issues. I really hope you enjoy Season 3 of Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? Welcome to the series on female icons, and it's a great pleasure today to speak to Glenn Stout, who has written a book that really moved me, Young Woman and the Sea, and has also been made into a film. And it's the story of the first woman to swim the English Channel, Gertrude Ederle. And obviously, you probably know I'm a cold water swimmer by now, and you can see why I'm so drawn to this book. I'm very excited about today's podcast. Glenn is a freelance writer, author, and editorial consultant, served as series editor of the Best American Sports Writing since its inception, and was founding editor of the year's Best Sports Writing. He is the author of Young Woman and the Sea, Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, Fenway 1912, and many others. Glenn began as a freelance career in 1986 and has been a full-time author since 1993. He has written, ghostwritten, or edited 100 books, representing sales of more than 3 million copies. Glenn has also served as a writing coach for private clients, given presentations to groups of editors, writers, and students about writing books, the writing process, and the editorial process he uses for long-form journalism. He also serves as director of the Archer City Writers Workshops at the Larry Mac Mur Literary Center in Archer City, Texas. Glenn grew up in Idaho, graduated from Bard College in New York, and lived in and around Boston for 20 years before moving to Vermont in 2002. He is a citizen of both the United States and Canada. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, Joyce.
Let's start by talking to you about your career so far. You've done so much and written so many books. So tell us a little bit about why you wanted to be a writer.
Well, I decided to be a writer when I was 14 years old, and I discovered the power of words in a poem that I read. And, from there, I worked on the school newspaper and I went to college where I studied poetry. And after college, I was working at the Boston Public Library in Boston, where I stumbled across a story that I thought was really interesting. It was a sports history story. I researched it in the microfilm newspapers and thought that maybe someone else would be interested in it because I was interested in it. And fortunately enough, a magazine bought the piece, and I've never been without an assignment ever since.
That's amazing. And you've what particularly interested you in the story of Trudy?
Well, when I was researching another project, again in the old newspaper microfilm, I kept on coming across headlines that mentioned Gertrude Ederle in the English Channel. And this really surprised me because I had done a lot of sports history, including a lot of sports history about female athletes, yet I had never encountered her name. And this was way back in like 2000 or 2001, and I kind of filed it away as like, boy, that's really interesting. Maybe there's a book there, because I did look up and see that there had been no books written about her. And over the next few years, I kept poking around at the story. I didn't have time to do a book project at that time. I had other book responsibilities to do. But several years later, I figured I had enough uh, accumulated enough information, and I put together a proposal and brought it to my agent, who brought it to my editor, and was fortunate enough that she thought it was a good idea too and purchased the book. That was about 2005 or 2006. I spent the next year or two researching and then writing the book. And it was supposed to come out in 2007, but they delayed it a year because the British author Gavin Mortimer had a book called The Great Swim, which also covered women swimming the English Channel. And then it was delayed again because of the 2008 recession and didn't come out until 2009. So it's been quite an arduous process. It's been essentially 25 years since I first had the idea, and 25 years later, now there's a film about it. And the funny thing is the book came out, and even though it got really good reviews, it didn't sell very well at all. I call it my all-time worst seller.
Tell us how the film came about.
Well, the film came about purely by accident as well. I mean, as I said, the book had come out, and people who read it liked it, but it didn't do very well. And then, out of the blue, Jeff Nathanson, who's a very accomplished screenwriter and also a producer, contacted me and asked if it was available for option. And I said it was, and I turned him over to my agent, who had told me previously that, any book project like this that gets optioned, the chances of it actually making it onto the screen are about 1,000 to 1. You can go on Twitter every day, and there are people thrilled that their property got optioned, and you'll never hear about them again. But uh, but then he also told me that the people involved with this, Jeff with his track record, and Jerry Bruckheimer, the producer, was already involved. That he said he thought there was a pretty good chance. He said it will happen. He says it might take a while, but it will happen. And the interesting thing was that Jeff Nathanson discovered the book in a used bookstore. And he went there specifically because he wanted to make a movie for his daughters. He had two teenage daughters. And he came across my book, and he later told people that, after he read the first couple of pages, he was like, this is it. And so, as I said, that was 2015. And swimming the English Channel is the perfect metaphor for having a book turned into a movie because, as you know, so many people try to swim the English Channel and they get close to shore, and then the tide changes and the current changes and they get pushed back out. And that's exactly what happened with this movie. We were close to shore a couple of times, and then first Paramount Studios dropped it, and then we were very, very close to shore with Warner Brothers. In fact, I was told to get ready to go to Liverpool at one point where they wanted to film. And then it got pushed away and they dropped it. And finally, Jeff and Jerry and the director Joachim Rennig, they didn't give up. And Disney decided that, if we could make it under a certain budget amount, that we would go ahead. And by that point, however, this was about 3, 4 years ago, I had almost given up on it because by then we were in the midst of COVID. But fortunately, I guess COVID is actually what allowed us to do the film because everyone they wanted involved, from the director Joachim Rennig to Daisy Ridley playing Trudy, they were both available because of COVID, because so much else had been shut down. And we were able to go to Bulgaria, which has a fabulous film studio that we could do it within the budget. And uh, it actually happened. So I was very, very thrilled when that took place. They sent me to Bulgaria for a week. I was able to visit the set and see some of the shooting. And, from the beginning, everyone involved was very, very committed to delivering Trudy's story to a contemporary audience. She was someone we deserved to know about. She was a pioneer. She changed everything. And as it turned out, both the director, Joachim Rennig at the time, he had two teenage daughters. Jeff Nathanson had two teenage daughters. Jerry Bruckheimer has one child, a daughter, and I have one child, a daughter, and now a granddaughter. So we were all making this, as Joachim Rennig has told people, for the daughters of the world. Everyone was really, really committed to that, as well as the actors, Daisy Ridley and everyone else.
That's absolutely fantastic, and I think the timing was perfect because lockdown, some good things did come from lockdown, and in the UK, certainly many people took up cold water swimming or wild swimming, whatever we want to call it, but they couldn't go to a gym or a sports centre or a swimming pool inside. So outdoor swimming became really, really popular. And I think your film has come out at the perfect time. Where certainly we have an explosion of people swimming, and especially women swimming in the UK. And it's just such a perfect story for us to hear because Trudy was really an icon of her era, and her achievement with such determination was absolutely fantastic. So it's so great that you've told this story. Now, we're going to come back to Trudy in a minute, but let's go through some of the things you detailed in your book, which I absolutely love, that the history of swimming. So tell us a little bit more about the history of swimming.
Well, when I first, started on the project, I realized I didn't know very much about the history of swimming, and I was surprised to discover that if one goes back before the 20th century, that very few people knew how to swim. And particularly women hardly swam at all. Of course, they were bound by moral restrictions of the day that meant they had to wear these heavy woolen swimming skirts which must have been like swimming with a burlap sack of potatoes on your back, you know. It wasn't very amenable to it, but even in the Western world, swimming was something that was done quite rarely. A lot of indigenous peoples swam, but in the Western world, it was not very popular. It was not considered very safe. And not many people did it. I always point to pictures of beaches at the turn of the century, at the turn of the last century, where you'll see the beaches black with people and hardly anyone in the water. And and there was one event that really spawned a change, and that was a boat accident in New York where an excursion boat full of mostly women and children from a church group caught fire and burned, and about 1,500 people ended up dying. And the reason they died was that they couldn't swim. And that kind of spawned a change because, many of them that were in water so shallow that if had they jumped in the water, they could have walked to shore, but they were so afraid of the water because they couldn't swim, they stayed on board and burned. And that really sparked a change in how people looked at swimming, and swimming began to be seen as a skill that one needed to have, not just for men, but also for women who previously they thought that like, well, women are only good for making babies, and swimming and sport activity is too difficult and too tough for them. Uh, but after that, it was seen as swimming might be a necessary life skill.
Yeah, it's terrible tragedy, but something that amazing that's come out of that. And you mentioned the woolen swimming costumes. Obviously, today I don't think we appreciate that these lovely water uh, enriching costumes that we wear weren't around back then, and we well, men and women were swimming in wool, which, as you said, sounds absolutely ridiculous. So I believe there was quite a few naked swimmers around at that time.
That's right. The men would sometimes swim naked, and they didn't have the same restrictions that the women did. So, I mean, even in the film, you see the young Trudy, swimming in the ocean, and she's wearing a dress and she's wearing shoes. I mean, you couldn't even show your ankle because that was considered so scandalous. And of course, at the same token, no one was swimming the modern freestyle stroke, the American crawl. The few people who did swim, most of them without fail, were either swimming the breaststroke or a very early version of the freestyle known as the trudgeon, which was a very complicated, almost side stroke, and wasn't very fast. And you put all of that together, and swimming was just something that was not possible for the vast bulk of people, and certainly for hardly any women whatsoever.
Yeah, when we've read your book for my one of my swimming groups, and some of them have been trying the trudgeon. I'm not sure if they're doing it right. It doesn't look very efficient at all. And going back to the history, so one of the things you mentioned, which I love. Well, it's terrible actually, but there used to be something called swimming a witch. So tell us about this.
Swimming a witch was just kind of underscores how bizarre and strange they thought swimming was. But when someone was thought to be a witch, one of the ways to test if they were was to throw them in water. And if they drowned, well, that proved they were not a witch. But if they didn't drown, if they knew how to swim, well, that was so out of the ordinary that they must have supernatural powers, and that was evidence of being a witch. Needless to say, most of the people and most of the women that they tested to see if they were witches drowned and were in fact not witches. But it just kind of underscores how swimming was seen as something extraordinary, not something that was reachable for the vast bulk of people, and certainly not reachable at all for women.
It's crazy. I don't know what they were thinking. There's no logic to that at all, is there?
Right.
Um, now yeah, let's talk about some of the icons of the swimming in this era. So we're sort of talking 1870s and onwards. So in your book, you talk about Annette Kellerman and Charlotte Epstein. So can you tell us about them?
Yeah, well, Annette Kellerman and Charlotte Epstein, before Trudy, are probably the two biggest figures in women's swimming. Annette Kellerman was Australian. She used a version of the American crawl that they called the Australian crawl, and she toured the world. It became very popular. She was very vivacious, she was attractive, and she would put on swimming exhibitions. And, crowds would show up, partially because they hadn't seen a woman swim, partially too because she didn't wear a full-length swimming dress, so there was that factor involved. But that's about the she was about the best known female swimmer of her time period. And then Charlotte Epstein, she rose to prominence in the wake of the disaster in that boat wreck, in that boat fire. They came to realize that the reason why all these women died is that they didn't know how to swim, and that was a tragedy and one that could be avoided. So, a life-saving organization started that began to teach people to swim, particularly women to swim. And then Charlotte Epstein spun that off into her own group called the Women's Swimming Association. She was very forward-thinking for her time, and she partnered with a coach, Louis de Breda Handley, who was a practitioner of the American crawl, and they started this association for young women, many of them girls, 12, 13, 14 years old, teaching them this new style of swimming. And Charlotte was very, very politically savvy, even though the powers that be in sport in America, this organization known as the American Athletic Union, did not think that women should compete or test themselves in any way physically. She was politically savvy enough to get the foot in the door for swimming competitions for women. And once those started taking place, that kind of built a momentum of its own. They were very popular. Uh, Crowds of hundreds and even thousands would show up at these open water pools to see young women swim. Part of it was the novelty of it. Part of it, again, was that they weren't wearing full-length dresses. But, the girls themselves, and I say they're girls because many of them were adolescents or just out of adolescence, they are the ones that made the case for women because they're the ones that got in the water, that started setting records, that started racing each other, that showed that women were just as competitive and just as athletic as men. And they made the case for themselves and started this movement, this momentum that over time made it less and less tenable for men to keep them out of the water, for men to keep women from competing. The first practitioners of the Women's Swimming Association, I think they're all real heroes, and Trudy and her sister Meg were two of them.
Wow. And what sort of year are we talking about then? When was the boating accident in New York?
The boating accident was in the early 1900s. And so,
Yeah.
this took another 20 years to build all this momentum, for the Women's Swimming Association to really take hold. So it didn't happen overnight. But, Charlotte Epstein was relentless. She was an independent woman. And she was a suffragette. She, advocated for the female vote and all of those things that didn't take place at the time. and was really at the forefront of, I say in the book that Trudy wasn't a feminist. She certainly became aware of how important what she did was to women, but that wasn't her original motivation. I think Charlotte Epstein was a feminist. Charlotte Epstein was an advocate for equality from the very beginning. So you had this nice pairing of both Charlotte and with Trudy that ended up succeeding on all fronts.
No, that's amazing. Now, let's talk about the swimming the channel. So it was 1875 that Matthew Webb was the first person to swim the channel, but it took 36 years for the next person to successfully cross it. So let's talk why that was the case. What happened?
Well, the first men that tried to swim the channel, and there were many men before Matthew Webb that did, and many of them died trying. Many of them, there was somebody come out of a pub and say they were going to swim across, and that was the last time they'd see them. But Matthew Webb was the first one to do it, and of course he did it using a combination of the breaststroke and the side stroke, neither of which were very fast. And that's one of the reasons why so many others failed. But the other thing was, I think the reason that Matthew Webb succeeded, it was almost accidental. He had great stamina, but he was able to take advantage of the tides and the currents. So even though he wasn't swimming very swiftly, if he got into the right tidal change and the right current, that tended to push you across in kind of a zigzagging pattern. Uh, but other swimmers didn't really pick up on that, and they were still using these strokes that weren't very quick. And, some men were trying, dozens of times, and most notably William Burgess, who coached Trudy in 1926, and a man named Jabez Wolfe, who coached Trudy in 1925. Wolfe, in fact, I think he tried and failed something like 22 or 24 times. Uh, Burgess tried a number of times as well, but Burgess was a little more serious. And even though he still used the breaststroke and the side stroke, he had a house at Cape Grenay in France where he would look out at the channel. And over time and through failure, he figured out how to use the tides and how to use the currents to get you across. He realized you couldn't swim straight across. You were fighting the tides and the currents. But if you timed it right and went with the tides and the currents, you could make it across in this Z pattern. And that's what he did to become the second person to swim the channel. Once he decoded that, several other men in only a few short years also swam the channel, but it was still taking them 16, 17, 18 hours, which is a long, long time. The water's cold, it's very grueling. It was still something that was not easily done.
One of my dear friends, Jessica Hepburn, who was one of the first people on this podcast, her story is she had failed fertility treatment and felt that she needed to prove that her body could do things. So she actually swam the channel and she wanted to do it breaststroke. She wrote a book called 21 Miles. She wanted to do it breaststroke and everyone told her she wasn't allowed. So maybe she was born in the wrong era. But she also climbed Everest, and you do mention in your book that there's a number of people who have climbed Everest. There's different numbers of people who've climbed Everest compared to the number who have swum the Channel. Can you tell us the figures?
Yeah, I don't know precisely what they are now because, of course, it's changing all the time. But many, many, many more people have climbed Mount Everest than have swam the English Channel. I mean, now, of course, we see pictures from the Himalayas where there's a line, a conga line of people, sometimes several hundred, all climbing at the same time to reach the summit. Whereas the English Channel is still a big challenge. And I always tell people that, if there were not boats accompanying channel swimmers, it would be incredibly dangerous, not just because of the boat traffic and all that, but simply because you're out there by yourself. It's far more dangerous, I think, than climbing Mount Everest. You if you don't make it across, you would not survive. Whereas Mount Everest, you can turn around and go back. I don't think anybody ever goes three-quarters of the way across the channel and turns around and goes back, although there are those people that do the double crossings, or like the swimmer Sarah Thomas, a double crossing, which is absolutely amazing. She was in the water over 50 hours. Um, but it's still, I think, even though the public may think it's commonplace because people do swim the channel regularly, it's not easy. And a lot of people still fail. And a lot of people only succeed after they try several times or work their way up, first becoming part of a relay team, accompanying other swimmers on the boat, being part of a cold water swimming group that, one of them swims and then the others decide to swim. It's still a terrific physical challenge, but one that, more and more people seem to be embracing.
Yeah, I did think about it very briefly. Well, I thought about it for a few months, and I thought about joining not swimming solo, but swimming as a relay team. And I looked into it, but because I do know so many people who have done it. The other person on this podcast who's done it is Dr. Heather Massey, who I work with on our cold water swimming research work. Um, but yeah, it's a huge commitment. It's a huge amount of time and effort, and that's today. Never mind about when we're looking at here with Trudy's story. So why is it so difficult? Tell us about these tides, and about, especially in your book, you make clear that so many people get almost there, and then they just can't get that last few miles.
Well, it's the nature of the configuration of the English Channel, which, La Manche, the sleeve, and it narrows and it widens, and currents change rather quickly and they're rather swift, and the water is really cold. You're usually swimming and it's much lower than your body temperature. In Celsius terms, it's about, probably about 14 degrees, I guess, in Fahrenheit, which we use over here, the water's around 60 degrees, which is very, very cold. You have to be acclimated to that. It certainly doesn't make it easy for your muscles to work. And there's just the stamina involved, along with, let's face it, some boredom involved, because you're doing the same thing for 14, 16, 18 hours, sometimes more, sometimes a little less, but you're doing the same activity over and over and over again. It's a mental challenge and a psychological challenge as much as it is a physical challenge. And, Trudy Ederle is someone who, embraced and broke both those barriers, both the physical barriers and the psychological barrier to swimming the channel. So, she is not really just important for women swimming, but for swimming in general. And, she was the first to use the American crawl to swim the channel, which is what virtually everyone uses subsequent to her. And, it kind of took a woman, I think, to break the mold, to try something new. The men seemed contented to just, try to do it the same old way over and over and over again. Once Trudy did it, that opened the gates. Everyone said, oh, this is the way to swim the channel. And they also followed William Burgess's advice of using the tides and using the currents, because you can get within, hundreds of yards of shore, and the tide changes. And your fatigue level is such, you get pushed back out, and then you can be swept by the currents. I think I read of someone a couple years ago who was within 25 yards or 25 meters of reaching, they came into the port of Calais and they were within 25 meters of reaching it, and they were at the end of their rope and they started going backwards, and their support group realized that they weren't going to make it, and they were pulled out of the water less than 100 meters from shore, which, after probably 14 hours in the water, which had to be devastating, but it just goes to show you just how difficult that task is.
It is totally devastating. I can't imagine, after all that preparation, to be so close but so far, and not get there. Let's move on to Trudy. So I loved your book. I loved the film. I cried a lot. I think everyone knows I'm a cold water swimmer. And it was just everything she went through, as you said about the history and the swimming costume and women not swimming. So let's start at the beginning about where and when she was born and growing up and why she wanted to do swimming.
Well, Trudy was a New Yorker. She was born in New York in 1903. Her parents were German immigrants. Her father was one of 20 children and
Wow.
immigrated to the United States, and he was a butcher. And they grew up in Manhattan. He had a butcher shop, quite a successful butcher shop. He did quite well. And, the first of the Ederle girls to swim was really her sister Meg. Her mother took them to see a swimming exhibition by the Women's Swimming Association, and she'd known, of course, about that boat tragedy, and she thought that, the girls deserved to learn how to swim. Uh, the father was supportive, but not quite as supportive. I mean, he helped Trudy learn for the first time. They had a summer house in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, where they would spend the summer. And Trudy first learned to swim there. Her father did tie a rope around her waist and walk out on a pier so she could swim alongside. But they were both swimming, the breaststroke. They were both encumbered, both she and Meg and the rest of her family. She had several other siblings. They were encumbered by their suits and everything. But when their mother heard about the Women's Swimming Association, she was like, the girls are going to learn how to swim. And Meg was initially, her older sister was initially the most successful. Trudy was hampered somewhat because she did have the measles as a child, and due to the fact of the high fever that came with having the measles, she became partially deaf. And she was a little socially awkward. It wasn't apparent to most people that Trudy was hard of hearing. In fact, I've heard recordings of Trudy speaking, and it's almost jarring because she has a heavy New York accent, which one does not expect to hear from her. But but because of her hearing issues, she was very close to her sister. She, like I said, she was a little socially awkward. She didn't like being in crowds because that could be disorienting. But she followed Megan to the water and really looked up to her sister. And her first motivations for swimming was she wanted to please her sister. She wanted to show her sister Meg that she could do it too. And there was the Women's Swimming Association started sponsoring some races, and there was a famous race, an open water race called the Day Cup race that Trudy competed in as part of the Women's Swimming Association. And at the time, she was not even on anyone's radar as one of their best swimmers. They'd been holding meets and they'd been getting some attention. And, they were starting to eat away at the notion that women couldn't compete. But at this Day Cup swim, which I think was in 1921 or maybe 1922, uh, Trudy won. And it was a revelation to everyone else. They had all been competing in sprints, everyone else. Trudy liked to swim by herself. She felt very comfortable in the water, and I think that had to do with her deafness. In the water, she could be herself. She didn't have to worry about not fitting in, about, not being able to hear, about being a little different. In the water, she said it was like she always felt when she was in the water, she was with a small child. She felt incredibly comfortable in the water and couldn't get enough of it. And after that Day Cup swim, both Charlotte Epstein and Louis DeBreda Handley kind of realized what they had with Trudy. And very, very quickly after that, she became the best of the swimmers in the Women's Swimming Association. And not only at longer distances, but then this is what I think is really amazing with Trudy is you can take the best contemporary swimmers like a Katie Ledecky or a Michael Phelps of a few years ago, and most swimmers are good at either shorter distances or somewhat longer distances. What Trudy was able to do is she was not only the best in the world at short distances, 25 meters, 50 meters, but also at longer distances. It would be like if Usain Bolt was also the world's best marathoner. And that's something that I don't care what sport you're talking about, simply doesn't happen, that someone is the best at every distance in a competition like that. But Trudy, almost from the very beginning, when she first started competing, because she just started to win, 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 she was easily the best swimmer of her generation, and I'd argue still one of the greatest swimmers, if not the greatest swimmer of all time.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. And you mentioned one of her key coaches, Lewis Handley, and he wrote a book, I believe, in 1924, Swimming for Women, and he was an Olympian. Why do you think he was so keen to promote women's swimming?
You know, that's a great question because he was kind of a Renaissance man. He was a gentleman. His family was very prominent. He'd competed in the Olympics in water polo. Uh, but you know, he was a big practitioner of the American crawl. In fact, he helped develop the American crawl. And I suspect that he found women were more amenable to trying something new than the men were. And in the Women's Swimming Association with Charlotte Epstein, he found the perfect school of students to try out his methods, and they all responded to it. And I think that's another, you know, it's kind of a subtle point, but it shows that the women were a little more agreeable to try something new than the men who thought they could just power through. I mean, you did have Johnny Weissmuller, who was the first great male swimmer who was using that stroke. But I think the women were really the first to embrace it in a large way.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And tell us a bit more about the Olympics. So, I think that it was the first women's swim and diving team went to Antwerp in 1920, and then Trudy went 4 years later. So, what was it like for them?
Right. When by the time Trudy went, they'd expanded the competition a little bit. Like you said, 1920, there were a few events. There were a few more in 1924, and virtually everyone on the team was a member of the Women's Swimming Association, of the women's team. There were a few West Coast swimmers, and I think one Hawaiian swimmer, but it was mostly the Women's Swimming Association. And Trudy was expected to take come back with three gold medals. She was competing in two sprints and she was also going to be in a relay and she was expected to win. But the women were not treated very well on the boat across. You know, if you were a swimmer, you know, if you were a runner, you could run on the deck. If you were a swimmer, and there was also a men's team made up of mostly Hawaiian swimmers from the American team, the only chance you had to swim while crossing the ocean was they had a large canvas tank about 10 feet square that they would, you know, tie a rope around your waist and you would swim in place. Well, the men got most of the time in that tank. The women really didn't get much time in the tank. You know, Trudy, you know, started to gain weight, and she was someone who thrived by swimming 3, 4, 5 hours a day. She was not used to being sedentary, and she got a little out of shape on the way across. And then when they got to France, it didn't get any better. The women, because they were afraid that they'd interact with French men and their virtue might be violated, were kind of put by themselves some distance away from the pool where they were supposed to train. So even then, even once they got to France, you know, she didn't get to spend hardly any time in the water. And so by the time it was time to compete, she still did well. She came away with two bronze medals and one gold in the relay, but she was not the enormous success that everyone expected her to be. So it was something of a disappointment, both for everyone else and also for Trudy. Later in her life, she said she found it very difficult to watch the Olympics because it would remind her of her own experience and it would make her cry because she felt such a keen sense of disappointment because by the time she went over in 1924, she was already pretty famous in the United States. There was a lot of pressure on her to win. And, you know, she felt like a failure.
Wow, I think two bronze is great, is a huge success. But I know I've heard other athletes be absolutely devastated by not getting that gold.
Sure.
And yeah, why do you think she then decided to swim the channel?
Well, you know, Charlotte Epstein was very savvy. She knew that publicity helped the Women's Swimming Association and helped the cause of female athletes. And she wanted one of the girls to swim the English Channel. And initially, it was going to be another swimmer named Helen Wainwright. in the wake, who did very well at the Olympics. And in the wake of the Olympics, she was pretty well known, and she was going to swim the channel, but she, hurt her leg stepping out of a streetcar, and they had to, cancel her trip across. And Trudy was still prominent enough that, Trudy said, I'll do it. Why don't you send me? And they did in 1925. She went over, but they wouldn't allow Charlotte Epstein, her coach, to really coach her. Louis DeBreda Handley couldn't go across, so they contracted out to Jabez Wolfe, who trained a number of swimmers. Because at the time there were a number of other female swimmers trying to swim the channel. I don't think any of them were as skilled as Trudy. Some of them ended up succeeding, but Trudy was, as a swimmer, was in a whole other league than these other women that were trying to swim. Not that they weren't good athletes, but they didn't have they hadn't had the athletic success that Trudy had had. She was not just the best swimmer, but the best swimmer of the American crawl and the fastest. So she had skills that they just didn't. And anyway, Jabez Wolfe was the coach, and Trudy went over with a chaperone. Again, kind of felt that she wasn't taken care of very well. Wolf didn't think she should spend a whole lot of time in the water, didn't think she should use the American crawl. He continued to advocate for the breaststroke. He thought there was no way anyone could sustain the crawl all the way across the channel. So they were sort of at loggerheads from the beginning. And when she finally made the attempt, when the weather conditions were right and everything, he wasn't particularly supportive. Trudy, after a few hours into the swim, she drank some beef tea. And after drinking the beef tea, she began to feel queasy. And another swimmer, an Egyptian swimmer, a man named Helmi, who was one of her training partners, and she was a close friend, Wolf sent him into the water to take her out. She always said that she was fine, that she could have continued, but it later came out that she suspected that she'd been drugged or poisoned. It makes sense. She never really went public with it. There was only one interview where she publicly talked about it, but it sort of makes sense because Jabez Wolfe was making quite a bit of money training women swimmers at the time. And once one woman made it across, well, the novelty of that was gone. Perhaps the other women wouldn't continue trying, and he would lose lose business. Um, and she remained cordial with him, but Trudy herself and her family has since told me this, that she believed until her death that she had been drugged, and that's the reason why she didn't succeed in 1925. And that was a huge disappointment, not just for her, but for women's swimming, because it allowed the men who were running the athletic associations to say, see, we told you a woman couldn't do it. If Trudy Ederle can't do it, then no one can do it. See, it's too tough for her. And but Trudy felt differently.
Yeah, thank goodness. Yeah. That's terrible. That's a terrible story, really. But then she had a successful swim. And what year was that? Who was her coach then?
That was in 1926, and they decided to change coaches, which was key because William Burgess by this time thought he'd cracked the code in terms of the tides, and was not as hostile to Trudy's swimming stroke and her style of training a lot. He liked his swimmers to train a lot, although he was still a breaststroker, and that was important. And it was also important that she was accompanied the second time by her family. She wasn't alone. And I think that was hugely important. When we started to work on the film, and I didn't write any of the screenplay or anything, but I was very fortunate that they involved me in the process. Jeff Nathanson involved me in the process and kept me apprised of what was going on every step of the way. And he showed me the first version of the screenplay, and we were talking about it, and he asked how I felt about it, and I said, well, the thing I was really, really happy to see was the relationship between Trudy and Meg, which is central to the book. is also was also central in the movie because I think the support of her family was really, really key for her. Again, she felt safe with her family. These were people she could be comfortable with. And particularly when you're being sent across the ocean, you're by yourself and you'd had a bad experience in the Olympics because you were kind of on your own, and a bad experience in 1925 because you were on your own. In 1926, she has her family with her, and she feels their support and their love. And I think as much as anything else, Burgess was certainly key also, but combined with the support of her family meant that she had people on her side. And I think that meant a huge difference. And he did crack the code of the tides, and he knew ahead of time exactly what route she was going to take. And pretty much she followed that route almost to the letter. Um, you know, a lot of swimmers would go out all the way to the end of Cape Grenade and leave from there. He would have them leave just a little bit north of there so they would be protected by the currents initially until they got past that point. That's one of the subtle changes that of strategy that he put in that Trudy was able to take advantage of.
Wow, it's a complicated swim for sure, and it's not really. We say 21 miles, but they don't swim 21 miles, do they?
No, no, they often swim twice as that, twice as far as that, because you have to go in this zigzag pattern that Burgess kind of first came up with, and that's exactly the path that Trudy took, and but still, she's in the water for 14 hours. The water temperature is frigid. You've got to worry about boat traffic even then. And, back then it was only, a few years after World War One. There were still mines floating around in the English Channel,
Oh,
and there were jellyfish. And as we've learned later, there were also sharks and things like that. It wasn't it wasn't just a swim in a pool, but Trudy knew that because she'd grown up in the Highlands where it was not rare for her to spend 2, 3 hours in the water. She'd swim around the pier. She had gone on long distance ocean swims before. She did swim from the Battery in New York City to New Jersey just before she left in 1925. So she was not afraid of the open water. And it's funny because Daisy Ridley, who did a great deal, almost all of her own swimming uh, during the filming, she is petrified of open water, and she's since talked about how
wow.
she can hardly believe that she actually did it because she's petrified of the open water, and in fact has not been in the water since the movie ended. She says,
Wow.
"Good luck to all you, everyone who enjoys that," but she didn't really enjoy it. But she took it as a personal challenge, and she did a remarkable job. Um, but Trudy, when she made it across, that proved it. You could no longer say that women couldn't compete. You could no longer say that women didn't have the physical capacity to do so. And for those people who've seen the film, the conditions that Trudy swam in were actually much worse than the way they're portrayed in the film. And the reason for that is, I think, as they were filming, Trudy swam through quite rough conditions. There were waves and swells of 6 feet. There was a storm that she had to swim through. Conditions were really, really horrible. There's not much of a storm in the film because they realized that having her buffeted by these waves, you couldn't keep the camera on her. So they switch things around a little bit and have her lost in the Goodwin Sands, which where the ships could go because it's so shallow there. That didn't, she skirted the Goodwin Sands in the real swim, but didn't really get lost in them. But they had to come up with a challenge where they could still keep the camera on her. And if you watch the film
Wow.
too, you see that she finishes the swim without her goggles. Well, she actually wore the goggles the whole time, but again, you can't. This is how movies are different from books. They wanted to be able to see her face. during the last part of the swim. So they have her lose the goggles. The goggles are actually in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. But that just underscores, just how difficult things were. It was actually much more difficult than it appears in the film.
Wow, Daisy did do a brilliant job. And if anyone is like me and I'm always Googling more things, if you go onto YouTube, you'll see lots of interviews with Daisy talking about the swim. And I mean, I can't believe that she was scared of open water. And also, there's a few, not many, but there are a few of Trudy as well, which is great to see. And so her sister designed her the first ever bikini, didn't she?
Right.
That's what she swam. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Trudy was bothered by the chafing of the sort of unitard that she'd been wearing because it would sag along her chest and capture water. It would stretch over time. And also the straps would chafe her shoulders. And she and Meg together decided, well, let's get rid of this. They bought some silk fabric and they designed a two-piece, which was considered sort of scandalous. I mean, women had been swimming in kind of unitards by that point, but to have your exposed midriff was like, oh my God, you can't do that. But that solved the issue. It was much tighter to her body. It didn't chafe her, and it was just much more comfortable. Same thing with the goggles. They had trouble keeping goggles sealed, and they discovered they could seal it with candle wax and keep water out. So the combination of those two things, it's unfortunate had they that they should have had a copyright or a trademark on the swimsuit design. They could have become billionaires, uh, but they weren't thinking that way. And in fact, I think that's one of the refreshing things about Trudy when you look at her and consider it in the contemporary context, is she was not out to become a celebrity. So often today, even athletes, yes, they want to win, yes, they want to compete, but they want to be a celebrity and then they want to cash in and they want to live off that the rest of her life. Trudy was not that way. She did what she did and seemed, she certainly did some things afterwards. She toured vaudeville for a while, but she was not a slave to celebrityhood. She was not a slave to what she had done. She continued to be her own person, and she was relatively content with, look, I've done what I've done, and I'm pleased with that. I don't need to continue to market myself. And very few contemporary athletes, I think, would take the same approach.
Yeah, for sure. Especially nowadays, it's all influencers.
Exactly.
And yeah, and it was it true about the music? And they had bagpipes and they had gramophones. Did those things actually happen?
Well, on the 1925 swim, they actually had a band on the boat to play music while she swam. Uh, most of them most of them got seasick while they're on the tugboat. So that didn't work very well. And the 1926 swim, they had a gramophone that they played records while Trudy swam because she liked to dance. She liked hot American jazz music. And as I think many swimmers will tell you today, and I'm not much of a swimmer, but I did run for a number of years, having a little music in the background is really helpful if you're doing something that's going to take several hours to do, right? And she realized that then, and she would sing to herself, and they'd have the music playing. Of course, she couldn't hear it terrifically well, but it was enough to give her a rhythm and give her a pace. And swimmers will tell you that that's incredibly important that you keep your pace up, that you don't slow down and speed up, but that you kind of can keep a steady pace going on. So that's all true. Fudged a little bit in the film, but essentially it's all true. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. That's really amazing. So, Glenn, on behalf of everyone who while swims, thank you so much for putting Trudy's name on the map and getting her known to all of us and hearing about how things were and the challenges that especially women had around that time period and all those brilliant female icons that did so much for women's sport. Um, just before I get on to the sort of last few questions that I ask all my guests. So for you, you've written lots and lots of books. So what sort of, have you got a favorite that you've written, or is there something in the pipeline that you're going to be doing in the next few years that you're really excited about? So tell us a bit more about Glenn.
Well, I have to say my favorite has to be Young Woman in the Sea, simply because of
Ah,
the impact that it's had. I mean, every day, it's been out nearly a year now. Every day I still hear from people either online or sometimes with an email sent to me or something like that, that it's had an impact on their life. Uh, I've been contacted by a number of channel swimmers. I've had people tell me that they swam the channel because they read my book, or now they're training to swim the channel because they've read my book. And that's the one, there's a lot of ripples in the water when you launch a book out into the world. And this one, without question, has had the most ripples. So I have to say it's my favorite. I'm not actually working on a book right now. I'm have a granddaughter who's just turned 4 years old and spending a lot of time with her. And I spend most of my time now. I do a lot of private editing on book manuscripts and book proposals and longer features. I teach workshops. Uh, I get as much satisfaction now and much gratification over helping others succeed in writing as I do myself. Having Young Woman in the Sea being turned into a movie is a nice capstone for a career, and I may write another book. I'm not quite sure, but right now I'm pretty content just trying to pass on to others what I know. I've got a vast experience writing a lot of different things, and I've become, I think, a pretty good teacher. And that's what I'm spending most of my time doing now. In fact, I'm off to Texas in a couple of weeks to teach a workshop in Archer City, Texas, as part of the Larry Mac Mur Literary Center, which I'm now involved in, which I'm really looking forward to. So, uh, you know, Trudy did what she did, and she passed that along and passed that forward, and we see what's happened. And I guess that's sort of what I'm trying to do with my own writing career.
fantastic. I'm doing a lot of work, being of that age as well. I'm doing a lot of work on listening to, I call them the elders, not the elderly, we're the elders. And
Right.
we have a lot of wisdom, and it's great to be able to share that with the younger generation, and especially teach. That's absolutely fantastic. Now, to finish my podcast, and I've asked this also for the book that I'm writing at the moment, I've asked lots of people what is their happy place and what makes them happy. And before I ask you, I just want to say that the vast majority say something to do with water. So it's really quite apt today. Not They don't necessarily need to be in the water. But a lot of them do, but not all of them. But even just by water. So Glenn, what makes you happy, and where is your happy place?
Well, if it's not in a baseball ballpark, because I really do enjoy baseball and ballparks, it's probably on the water, either here on Lake Champlain where I live. My property goes down to the lake, so I can
Oh,
go out there every day. Or, my mother is from Newfoundland in Canada, and she grew up on the water. And when I go up there, my relatives all live on the water, and I love just being out there and being able to see it. I kayak a lot here on Lake Champlain, so there's few things I like better than to go out on the kayak. I'm not a very good swimmer, but I do enjoy, kayaking for 4 or 5 hours, all by myself, a couple of miles from shore. I really enjoy that. Those would be my happy places.
I have interviewed too many people who say they have properties that go straight to the water. Serious, what we call FOMO now. I am seriously thinking of moving to be closer to water. I might not be able to afford somewhere on water, but certainly somewhere where I can see it every day, which I don't have at the moment.
Right.
And the very, 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 very last question, and this is the teacher in me, but Glenn, what advice would you give your younger self?
To be, I think I showed a lot of patience, which was really good. Although there were times where I questioned whether I was being too patient. And now, I sort of don't think I was. So don't be too impatient, particularly when you're doing something like writing, which takes a long time to really learn what you're doing. And I work with a lot of younger writers who are already frustrated. They're maybe 30 years old and they're frustrated that they're not as good as this writer, not as good as that writer, and they're comparing themselves to others. And you need to stop comparing yourself to others and compare yourself to yourself. You can't write like someone else. You can't swim like someone else. You have to learn what works for you. And I think that finally, after doing this for 40 years, I finally know what works for me, and that's something that I hope to share with other people. Uh, because you can self-sabotage and beat yourself up when you compare yourself too much to others.
That's really beautiful. And I'll tell you, I wanted to write my first book in 1987 when I just finished my PhD, and I didn't publish that book until 2021.
Right. It can, well, the Trudy Ederle book took, over 20, almost 25 years from book to film. The last book I published, which was a true crime story about this couple in the 1920s, that's a book that was 15 years in the making. So things don't always happen fast, but as Trudy Ederle teaches us, if you stay in the water long enough, you might just get across.
Fantastic. That's a brilliant last line to finish this podcast. So Glenn, thank you so much. That's just been so interesting. I know I'm very biased being a swimmer but a swimmer who will probably never swim the channel. But thank you so much for writing a beautiful book and for being involved with the film. And it's really been great to chat to you today.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.